I'm assuming you probably think they started to cut corners more and more and more, but yeah, just love to hear your thoughts on that and kind of a timeline maybe.
Certainly, absolutely. So right off the bat, they have always cut corners, the extent of which just became greater and greater as time went on. While I was assigned to the 4L80E, we would be releasing annual updates to that transmission. However, that's something that's common. General Motors did that with most all their transmissions annually. Pretty much any model you look at, that was occurring to some extent. And updates were for one of three reasons. An update to the transmission could have been an improvement for a problem, although that was not terribly common. Or if it was occurring, it honestly was being done with the almost least amount of financial component possible. Other than being updates for a problem, there were updates to cut cost, and there were updates, how should I say this? I guess to an extent, there were some performance-oriented updates, but not much. Again, here for the most part, this was really cutting cost. One of the best examples I like to give people was actually for the 4L60E, which many people know there's been a history of issues that did not really seem to be resolved for the most part. There's a very popular update for people who like to replace the planetary gear assemblies from their original 4-pinion models to a 5th-pinion model. And the market generally refers to that as an upgrade, but it's actually not. It was just a cost-cutting measure. What they did is they wanted to make a less expensive planetary. They managed to do so by reducing the quality of the metallurgy and the surface treatment or surface hardening process. The reason that a 5th pinion was added was because when they created this planet with the inferior materials and 4 pinions, they were failing pretty much right away to a far greater extent than the original 4 pinions. The purpose of additional pinions is to further distribute the load of those planetary gears, and they needed the 5th pinion to make this thing actually be survivable. So a lot of guys say, oh, it's 5 pinions, it has to be better because it has better load distribution. If we had an apples to apples comparison where you had a 5th pinion planet with the original metallurgy, it would be 100% an upgrade. But being that it had worse metallurgy, worse surface hardening or surface treatment, it was actually even inferior to the original 4 pinion. GM has a lot of instances of doing that. I was talking a lot with the 6-speed guys who were creating the 6L80E, 6L90E at the same time. That transmission was in development since the early 2000s, late 90s. And as I'm sure you know, and your other guests have told you, that's actually a ZF transmission design. Ford had a model, which is going to be their 6R80 and other variants. The ZF transmission itself that was originally designed is the 6HP series, and those went into a multitude of European cars as well as some American. Ford pretty much took the identical 6HP ZF transmission. They cast a case where the bell housing would work with their engines, and for the most part left it just the way ZF had it. General Motors, that wasn't good enough for them. That was too expensive. So they redesigned the pump assembly, the valve body, and what's called the TECM, or the control module inside that transmission. The pump, the valve body, and the TECM are the 3 most problematic components in that transmission. So again, yes, your valve body, your separator plate, the valves in the valve body, and the pump essentially is very similar. It has similar valves that have to work like the valve body, not to the extent for shifting, but for creating pressure recovery, line pressure, cooler circuit pressure, torque converter pressures, all those circuits, very vital. And they're most importantly helpful for lubrication to the transmission, but more also on the same level, cooling the unit. So it running hot, it not having lubrication well enough to keep the valves and the valve body alive. That was a major issue with that transmission. And again, that was just all cost-cutting measures that General Motors felt they needed. And honestly, just make it inferior.
What sort of constraints are they putting on engineers? Because I can't imagine the engineers all want this. They're usually prideful. And people that are in engineering are like, they want to build good things.
You could not be more correct. When I was first starting out with General Motors Powertrain, there were a lot of gentlemen who had been with the company and the division particularly for a long time. They really expressed to me how things had been slowly changing over the years. Annually, there's a major meeting where engineers propose their planned updates for a particular transmission. This also happens for other powertrain components like engines, differentials. But we would have a meeting. The engineers on that transmission assignment would be sitting at the table, as well as people from essentially some of the financial divisions, people who are going to determine how much money is going to be spent making changes to a transmission. That also incorporates planning how much money is going to be spent making the repairs at the dealer. A lot of thought goes into this. And generally, we would say, honestly, wholeheartedly, what we felt was needed, what we felt should be changed. And there would be a lot of back and forth over pennies because they add up substantially with the volume that General Motors produces. And we were free to really, in the early days at least, kind of propose anything. But almost always, unless a problem was quite severe, we would be told the cost is too high. Give me a less expensive option. And that would go on for several tiers. Okay, that's still too expensive. Give me another option that we can save money on yet again. And let's say 5 engineers sat down at the table, they would eventually have one of us all propose a different solution with different avenues of cost. And as time went on, that would be something that they would cut back on the amount of engineers coming to the table. If an engineer kept coming up with expensive solutions, eventually they would kind of not be welcomed to enter the discussion at all.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. And we would kind of be labeled as almost a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of guys started to see that and felt they wanted to make sure they hung in there to get their pension, make sure that any of the union employees would not have to lose all the money they put into that program, which honestly happened quite a bit, especially when General Motors finally, filed Chapter 11 and finally said, there's a big issue. They also really tried to have people from GM Financial advise us to take our savings and invest it in General Motors, which a lot of us did because they matched and they made it a very attractive offer to make these investments. But a lot of guys lost everything. They were told, keep holding on, it'll rebound. But when things completely crashed, there were gentlemen who told me they had hundreds of $1,000s lost. I didn't lose that much. Fortunately, I was advised by someone outside of GM Financial, which fortunately kept me from losing a lot. In terms of that engine, I still talk to several of the engineers who were there. Unfortunately, it's most people that I have never worked with, but I still do speak with them and I still do consult for them just for outside opinion. A lot of the engineers value some of what I can offer, but they're intelligent and they all have great ideas. It's just come to a point where cutting cost is the biggest concern. As you've discussed already, there's a planned obsolescence, so to speak. After many years of General Motors experiencing people wanting to just lease a car, not keep it, and also minimize the amount of service spent on the vehicle. People really were not interested in maintaining vehicles, and that's not the entire population. Obviously, there's people who really want to keep a vehicle and do maintain it, but there was an overwhelming amount of people who would lease through GM Financial, and honestly, people who lease their cars for 2 or 3 years often just destroy them. And I mean from accidents, I mean from lack of maintenance and lack of service. So GM kept seeing this, and they finally said, if people don't want to maintain them, well, we're going to give them a product they don't have to maintain. And that slowly transitioned in from the very early 2000s to a point by, I'd say, 2008, 2009, 2010. That was in full swing with their engine oil life monitoring system, with their proposed maintenance, saying, don't service your transmission for 100,000 miles, don't change your coolant for 150,000 miles. And as you know, eventually that was Don't ever change your coolant. Don't
Yeah.
ever service your transmission. And that was part of bringing in further planned obsolescence. They wanted you to have a car for 100,000 miles, have it essentially die so that they can sell you another car. A lot of people felt that they wanted you to have a car go out of warranty so that they could have dealers repair them. For the most part, GM doesn't own their dealerships, at least back then. Most were not. And GM really didn't see profit from repairing these cars. So it wasn't a big factor. My regional representative, when I was a field engineer going to dealer, told me many times, we're not interested in fixing these cars. GM sells cars. So if the dealer wanted to make a profit repairing cars, that was on them. That was to their benefit. But GM as a corporation could not care less. They just wanted to sell another car or lease another car. That was their objective. And as you can see, that planned obsolescence is just
Yeah.
coming further and stronger than ever.
I
Cars
think
obviously not making it 100,000 miles.
if you want to watch the full interview with Cello, click right here.